Everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law News produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright, and we're just going to run through some of the news stories that have been coming up this week. I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Amelia. Hello, everyone. Great to be back, and we've got some more stories for you. My name is Peter. I'm the solicitor and managing director at Digital Law, and it turns out there's been quite a bit happening during the course of the last week, so I'll hand back to Amelia to take us through.
Thanks, Peter. So our first story of the week is looking at WhatsApp. I mean, if I could count the amount of times that we've taken a news story through WhatsApp this year, it'd be off the charts. So WhatsApp is launching a new service for businesses to communicate directly with their customers. So the messaging system is one of several platforms that Meta has launched a more kind of shopping focused feature. We've seen it through Instagram and Facebook more recently as well. So they'd be looking at using cloud-based software that enables apps to communicate with each other, and it will open up WhatsApp to be for businesses, and especially it'll be free for smaller firms to encourage kind of business growth. And it's kind of, that's exactly what Mark Zuckerberg has said. He said that the development would help companies customize their experience, specifically looking at smaller businesses. The service would be using API, which allows two apps to talk to each other. And I will pass over to Peter to continue with this.
Yes, the irony of WhatsApp trying to engage more business users. The trouble is that this does not change any of the inherent reasons that mean that we shouldn't really be using WhatsApp for business-related activity. First of all, its servers, it's very difficult to actually tie down in terms of where the data is actually being kept, because very often it's being moved between multiple facilities in Europe and the United States and other continents. Based on use, based on demand. Depending on the country, of course, that data could be looked at by different government surveillance systems, depending on the jurisdiction that you're talking about and their security measures, investigatory powers, etc. So there's that side to it, i.e. the data on there isn't necessarily as secure as we might hope. And then there's also the fact that WhatsApp is a commercial organization owned by Meta. They are always looking to monetize the data that they have, and to basically take your WhatsApp communications and marry it up with a Facebook profile or an Instagram profile and build up a richer picture of an individual so that they can serve targeted advertising. So both of those things mean that the data on there is not exactly private. Now, okay, great, they want to target SMEs with this. If you are just a small organization looking to, where ordering widgets and distributing them to people, I wouldn't want to use a system ideally that you can't really say this definitely complies with the legal and regulatory requirements in Europe or the UK, but there probably wouldn't be a huge amount of blowback if you did use it. Where I think it presents a problem is if you were in a specialist, highly regulated sector. So, for example, if you're in something like financial services or medicine or pharmaceuticals or accounting or banking or these sorts of things, or insurance for that matter, I would be very careful about engaging and using a platform like WhatsApp for business-related purposes. There are other better, more secure platforms that you could use to allow you to communicate with your customers and your customer base and your clients, or indeed to use such instant messaging systems for internal communications. So it's not great. I understand people very often say, well, why can't we use it? We see screenshots where politicians have been using it and celebrities use it and government people use it. Why can't we use it? And it's like, well, just because they use it doesn't mean that they should be using it. And we've seen, and we've talked about on this discussion previously, on this podcast previously, we have looked at the official guidance from the security services, MI5 in the UK, and from the official policy of the British Army, which is don't use WhatsApp. They recommend using Signal instead. And if you're looking for a free platform to use, that's what we would recommend to anyone listening now. because there isn't a copy of the information on a secure server. On Signal, the data is on the handset of the sender and the handset of the recipient, and that's it. And it's encrypted, so in theory it cannot be accessed. So it remains properly secure. If you've looked at the publicity around this new business initiative from WhatsApp, I would just take it with a very large pinch of salt. And I say, if you're in a regulated sector, you shouldn't be considering it. And to be honest, if you're even a growing business, I'd think twice about it. But certainly, yes, if you are highly regulated, you shouldn't be using it anyway, and you shouldn't be using this new initiative that they're offering.
I think another potential red flag here that could go kind of amiss is the fact that businesses will be able to build a customized dashboard to chat with shoppers directly and offer customer services more easily. But there is every chance here that this direct chat could be kind of hacked into, that it could be used for nefarious purposes, because it is just there to be able to contact people. And if you've got a large customer base, you could specifically target customers that you potentially know have a lot of money, for example, and try and extort that. And kind of there is not a lot of protection here, especially with it being so new. Is there any kind of legal kind of regulations that have come out about this yet, Peter?
Not really. There was supposed to be, at the same time that GDPR came in 2018, there was supposed to be an e-privacy regulation introduced across Europe that would look at things like communication systems, and it would regulate them, and it would use GDPR's claim enforcement matrix, so similar thing, tens of millions of pounds of fines. But everyone will have seen that this week, the week that we're recording, is the 5-year anniversary of GDPR. Yes, 5 years since that barrage of emails asking you for your consent. Fun fact, if someone emails you asking you for your consent, they haven't got your consent and they shouldn't be emailing you, and that was illegal under the old law, but we'll draw a veil over that. But the point is that, time is already ticking on. We're already now 5 years on from that point, and still there is no e-privacy regulation. And I was speaking to a friend of mine who is heavily involved in sort of observing what's happening from a policy perspective in Brussels, and we were laughing and joking about this week, that it's a bit like waiting for Godot, waiting for the e-privacy regulation. We've been waiting for 5 years and there's still no sign of it, but we're still sat cross-legged on the floor waiting for it. And it just fails to arrive. It fails to arrive. In the meantime, regulation of communications platforms remains based on the e-privacy directive from, drumroll, 2002. So in 2002, it's trying to regulate a world that no longer exists, because we now have sophisticated instant messaging systems on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. They all have their direct DM, direct messaging systems, instant messaging. And you've now got something like WhatsApp, and you've got other very sophisticated systems, Telegram, etc. So these systems aren't being properly, effectively regulated anyway, from a data protection and privacy perspective. And then you get them being exploited for fraud purposes. And we've seen in documentaries like the Tinder Swindler, watch it now on Netflix. It's terrifying, chilling, hilarious all at once. And the hilarious bit is the fundamental inability of investigatory services, the police in different countries, don't have the resources that they can use to track people down who might be engaging in fraudulent spam communications using instant messaging, and very often don't investigate. And there is a huge number of people constantly being ripped off, constantly being subject to scams, and they're simply, apart from local law enforcement saying, oh, issue a warning about this or a warning about that, they are actively investigating, arresting and enforcing against people. And that remains a problem, and that is a problem for stretched investigatory services across Europe and the US that simply don't have the budgets to do this properly. And the scammers know this, and they're doing more and more of it because they know that the chances of them being caught are low. The chances of them ripping off enough people for a good sum of money remains way too high.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story today, we're looking at the ICO fine of Clearview AI. So the Information Commissioner's Office has fined Clearview AI just over £7.5 million for using images of people in the UK and elsewhere that were collected from the web and social media to create a global online database that could be used for facial recognition. So the ICO has also issued an enforcement notice ordering the company to stop obtaining and using personal data of UK residents that is publicly available on the internet and to delete the data of UK residents from its systems. This investigation comes as part of the Australian Information Commission, which have focused on Clearview AI's use of people's images, data scraping from the internet, as well as use of biometric data and facial recognition. So there's a fair amount to unpack here in relation to the amount of data that's being taken, as well as the quite sizable fine that has been imposed. So I will pass over to Peter for this.
Yes, I think the first thing with this is the size of the fine. I mean, we've seen that the ICO did big fines back in 2021 on Marriott and British Airways, but those fines were actually massively reduced from the hundreds of millions they were after at the time down to sort of 20 million because of the ravages of the pandemic and the fact that both of those industries were heavily hit by the COVID lockdowns. Here, though, there's several interesting things to unpack. One is that this is a joint investigation with the Australian Information Commissioner. The UK has signed a trade deal with Australia. I don't think people thought regulatory cooperation will be on the menu as a result of that. And maybe it isn't a distinct part of that deal, but the fact that the ICO has contacted its Australian counterpart, carried out this joint investigation, shows that just because you may be beyond, overseas from the UK, doesn't mean you're necessarily out of reach of the regulators. A similar thing happened in Canada with actually chasing down one of the companies that was involved in potentially taking data of UK citizens when it came to the referendum in the UK in 2016 on leaving the EU, where some data hadn't necessarily been, I think it was aggregate IQ, and they had potentially gathered data in a way that wasn't consistent with GDPR either. And in that instance, the Canadian regulator was willing to play ball as well with that investigation. And in this instance, the Australian Information Commission has done the same thing. I think the fact that we have John Edwards, who is the new UK Information Commissioner, who is from that part of the world anyway, New Zealand, it could be that he's been able to make a few phone calls and smooth the path of that investigation as well, but probably don't want to play that up too much because he's only been in post for a few months, and these investigations, this was probably underway last year with Elizabeth Denham. So, but you never know, that may have been one factor at play in this. The other is the sheer volume of data, 20 billion images that have been scraped online, used, processed, manipulated without the knowledge of those of the people in question. I went about faces and then other biometric information, much of which have been scraped online in order to then build up profiles of people. So you are then at that point identifying people. It's personal data, GDPR applies, and that's where the need for investigation has followed. I think this is quite, you'll gather, I think it's quite an important piece of enforcement for all of those reasons. Chief of all being the fact that you can carry out enforcement, even if in this instance we're talking about Clearview AI Inc. So it's not a limited company, it's based overseas, but it's still facing this enforcement from the UK. And clearly that enforcement will be effective because we're then using those enforcement mechanisms in another country. So just because you're overseas doesn't mean that you can't be contacted. Just because the UK has left the EU doesn't mean that overseas enforcement isn't possible. And indeed, in what remains, funnily enough, a global world where you've got data being shared across borders all the time, that's the nature of the internet. Knowing that companies can face enforcement from regulators in other jurisdictions hopefully will mean they will think a little bit more carefully before doing a data gathering exercise of this type, knowing you could be on the end of a pretty hefty fine like that of £7.5 million. And that's just it. Previously, fines of a couple £100,000 would be laughed off. Unless you're Elon Musk, 7 million is not to be sniffed at. So hopefully this will have an impact on the behaviour of the organisations like Clearview that acquire and process such large volumes of personal data.
Thanks, Peter. I think it's important to mention here what the company actually does. So the company provides a service that allows customers, including the police, to upload an image of a person to the company's app. This app then checks for a match against all the images in the database, and the app then provides a list of images that have similar characteristics with the photo provided by the customer, with a link to the website from where the images came from. And although Clearview AI is no longer offering services in the UK, the company has customers in other countries that are still using the personal data of UK residents. They've already collected this data, so if someone from the police was searching for a particular person, they could still be running it through UK residents, which is fairly scary as well.
It is, and it suggests that the way that the data is just collected and put into one massive big pot means that you couldn't ring fence and isolate, for example, UK users or EU users. The whole lot's in there and is searchable by the look of it. So you can't sort of say, oh, well, because of, whatever reason, we're going to make sure that certain people cannot be indexed and searched against. That there is nothing to stop that by the look of it. It's just all one big system, one huge pot of 20 billion images, and that's being searched and manipulated for those reasons.
Yeah, and they can then be linked to websites where those images had come from. So if, say, for example, an image had been taken from, I'll use myself, for example. I know for a fact that previously when I attended school, my image had been used on the school website. And say if you search for my face now, it's probably likely you'd be able to find those images. And you could therefore get information about myself that's perhaps not readily available, such as the school that I used to go to. And that can be quite worrying for some potentially vulnerable people as well here.
Exactly, because where you've got things like, large group photos that are always there from things, if you think like schools or in healthcare or in public sectors where you've got large teams of people where there might be large group photos that are taken and then that's then up online, then that's the sort of thing that could be searched against. So that typifies the problem really, and you're quite right when you're sort of saying yes, it could be if you've been at school, or it could be if you've been involved in any other institution. There is a likelihood then that photos have been taken and are being easily shared online and then being harvested by organisations like Clearview that are simply then scraping data from any source they can find globally to build up a database like this.
Thanks, Peter. And that very nicely leads us on to our next story. So this is taking us across the world to China. So this story is based on the Chinese detention camps. And so as you're probably aware, China is very secretive and has very secretive systems of kind of data. And consequently, this has been hacked, and we have been able to investigate and authenticate the data leak of some of the minorities that have been incarcerated. And this hacked file contains more than 5,000 police photographs, which have been taken between January and July 2018. And using accompanying data that has been hacked, there are 2,884 photos that show people that have knowingly been detained. And these have been listed into re-education camps where they're not necessarily educated students. So this is incredibly interesting, from kind of the personal data point of view as well as a human rights point of view. I mean, we'll mainly be looking at the personal data here that has been collected, but by no means is the human rights kind of side of things any less important. So I'll pass over to Peter to continue with this.
Thanks, Amelia. I think one of the key elements here is that we are talking about data that would not have come to be published and shared globally if it had not been hacked. As you've said, this data actually dates from 2018. We know that there have been camps doing this activity in China, and that those camps have indeed expanded since 2018, where the Uyghur minority population is being funneled into them for what is classed as sort of re-education and training. And there has been, people have been to these camps and then there's been like witness testimony of this is what's happening here. But whenever it's been raised, the Chinese state has turned around and said, no, it's not like that at all. They're merely, re-education camps. They're merely for students. Nothing going on here. Nothing to see here. And then when they have allowed foreign observers in to take a look, of course, it's all been very carefully sanitized, and it's sort of shown them being taken around what look like school rooms with everyone's all, any problems here? And everyone goes, no, nothing's wrong at all. Everyone's very happy. And then you'll have to leave now, and everyone's then shown out. So the Western observers haven't seen anything to suggest there was anything too amiss, but there's been rumour, and as I say, from those who've survived the system and gone through it, they've said some of the terrible things that are taking place and some of the awful human rights abuses. This is now the smoking gun. This is the evidence that shows it. This would not have been found out by the rest of the world were it not for the leaking of this data, and a hell of a big volume of data we're talking about at that, which shows that it's widespread abuses that are taking place. And the fact is, this has then been worked on. So the BBC, as well as other media agencies, have gone through the data to identify various things that are taking place before then publishing it last week. So there's lots of images and documents that they've been through and reviewed with a consortium of international journalists. It includes things like stills from CCTV footage, stills from video footage, security footage, as well as internal documents, records. I mean, camps like this don't operate in isolation. They leave a massive bureaucratic paper trail behind them, and that's what's ended up being contained in this. Hundreds of spreadsheets with names and addresses and ID numbers of over 250,000 people who are being funneled through these camps. So the evidence is now out there. The world can see exactly what's taking place in China, and the Chinese government keeps on saying, oh, this is an internal Chinese issue, it's nothing to do with anyone else, thank you very much. Sorry, when there's major human rights abuses, it is something that the rest of the world needs to think about quite carefully, and at least this actual evidence is now out there for the world to see.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story. This is looking at the Australian Tinder swindler. So I believe we've spoken about before the Tinder swindler on Netflix. I think, Peter, you mentioned it earlier today. So this is looking at yet another person who has used social media as a way to gain money from romance. And so in this case, actually, the man in question had married this lady, and he was using her as his own kind of cash cow, and was asking her to pay for things for him, saying, oh, he's getting all this money soon, and every time reassuring her he'd be getting this soon, as well as kind of reeling her in with a sob story that his ex-wife had died from a painful cancer, when I will add she was in fact alive and they just divorced. So this is just yet another example of how social media is being exploited and used for fraud. I'll pass over to Peter to continue unpicking this.
I hate to say it, it's always men, isn't it, unfortunately? But so yeah, it's a man in the Tinder swindler, and it's a man here who's been, ended up finding several women through Tinder that they can then use to as a source of income, saying, oh, actually in a relationship, but I've got loads of money tied up in these properties, but we just need some money to tide us over. Would you mind loaning me $200,000? And in this instance, it looks like he's done this with multiple people. It's not on Tinder, needless to say, it's Bumble. I think it's been used along with several other apps. And it looks like eventually, actually, it says it was I think it was this chap's daughter who actually ended up revealing the deceit that was being carried on. And this is the daughter that this man had with the ex-wife, who was an ex-wife and not actually dead as a result of terminal illness. But just an example of, you walk around telling people a story like that just to elicit sympathy and pity. Pretty low. Again, it is always men that we always hear about doing this. but an example of the fact that you don't necessarily know who it is that you are meeting and what is true and what is lies when you meet them on social media, in the same way that you don't when you meet them in a bar or in a workplace. You don't necessarily know someone's background. Apart from the fact that if you meet someone in a bar, you can go and ask that person's friends perhaps and find out a picture of, you know, exactly what might be true and what might be porkies that way. Or if someone, you know, is, you know, has been, say, employed at a company for a long time, you would know that that person probably was what they said they were, but no guarantee. But it just means that I think that it's almost like the risks are amped up when you meet someone online, and then when this happens, probably fairly quickly. You know, he probably meets them, you know, gets to know you in a few weeks, and oh, at first everything's hunky-dory, and then suddenly something will happen to say, oh, would you mind lending me some cash? You know, and unfortunately, in order to keep a relationship going, sometimes people are then willing to put cash into that to keep it going. Sad but true.
Thanks, Peter. Moving on to our next story. This is kind of an echo of something we covered in the last few weeks. So this is looking at the Bar Standards Board hack. So this is kind of a bit of an update here. So to recap, a malicious cyber attack on the Bar Standards Board about a month ago had occurred for about the fourth time in a year, and it has proved catastrophic for the regulator after a meeting it had with its governing board yesterday. So for around a month, staff had been frozen out of their emails, and experts have had to have been drafted in to kind of try and figure out the stability of the system. And this has caused literally chaos throughout the profession. So I will pass over to Peter to kind of go through this and why this is so important from a legal standpoint.
It's not great when you're a regulatory body telling everyone to take care of your data and have secure systems, and then your systems are themselves compromised. So it's never great from a credibility point of view when that happens, and that's exactly what's happened in this instance. So this is, you know, the barristers' profession is regulated by the Bar Standards Board, which is the main regulator is the Bar Council, with devolved responsibility to the Bar Standards Board. And in this instance, they've had to take their systems offline. There's been a great deal of problems, malicious code, yada, 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 only just regained access to their email, a lot of problems. The BSB chair saying it will take a long haul until they properly recover. Now, this is a problem when, in particular, there have been a lot of stories within the last few years of barristers' chambers being hacked, and there have been instances of individual barristers' systems, also email systems, being hacked, because let's not forget that all barristers are, in effect, their own little companies. They're all self-employed, and then just working collectively in a chambers. So there's been a lot of problems around that, and indeed the Bar Council and the Law Society of England and Wales, representative body of solicitors, got together last year to try and say, well, how do we actually restore some confidence here? And there is now an official questionnaire that has been agreed between the Law Society and the Bar Council as a result of a lot of close work by a working group that was put together, and then both the Bar Council and the Law Society consulted widely to say, look, we have this 4-page questionnaire. Is it helpful? Does it work? Is it too onerous? Is it at the right level? And it's hoped it's at the right level. It's now been working for about 2 months. So the idea is that this questionnaire is sent by a law firm to a barrister's chambers at the point when a barrister is first instructed. I mean, some law firms funnel huge volumes of work through to different barristers' chambers. I worked at one law firm where literally it was sort of hundreds of active cases at any one time being acted by one particular chambers on behalf of all the work for that firm, and that firm did a lot of bulk litigation work. So there can sometimes be a huge flow of information, a huge exchange of information, and this is trying to say at the outset of the relationship, have some clear agreement in terms of the law firm and the chambers just to, you know, ask questions. You know, how secure is the system? Where will the data be kept? How long will it be kept for? What will it be used for? What are the systems and practices in place? You know, what email system have you got? What cloud have you got? What IT systems have you got? What security measures do you have? What training is in place? All of these sorts of things. And the idea is that in the true fun way of compliance, you sort of do this exercise and then probably review it every 6 to 12 months or so. So there's been a nice attempt to sort of have a greater grasp of the risks that are inherent between law firms instructing barristers. And it's not great at all when, as I say, that's been agreed between the Law Society and the Bar Council, and then the Bar Council's regulator, the Bar Standards Board, is compromised in this way. It really isn't ideal. But I think it's a little reminder to make sure that anyone can be hacked, no matter the size of their systems and the resources and the security measures that they have. So if you do get caught, isn't it a nice idea if you can then fall back and say, well, we did try and minimize the risks, and we did have this questionnaire, we did have an ongoing dialogue, and they told us what information they've got. At least you've got something to fall back on to show that you did consider these risks before the worst then happened.
Thanks, Peter. That leads us very nicely into our next story. So this is relation to the Ints group, which they had a cyber attack more recently, and it's the fact that the cyber attack last month, because it was a publicly traded law firm, has had a huge impact, not just from the cyber attack itself, but more long-term problems as well. So I will pass over to Peter to discuss these long-term problems that aren't necessarily quite as foreseeable as others.
Indeed. So here we have the story of a law firm that's been hacked. What's the difference? Well, this is a law firm that's publicly traded, so it has shares. And those shares have fluctuated quite wildly from being a peak of 191 pence in September 2018. They're now at the time that this story took place this week, they're at 21.5 pence, having gone down as low as 16 pence during the day when this story came out. And then hearing that you've had a cyber attack, and this has then perpetuated, in their words, speech marks, difficult operating conditions for a short period of time, and they have a disaster recovery process in place, and they've appointed a team of specialists, and yada, yada, yada. That's great, but when your business is helping clients and looking after those clients to the best of your ability, and client's best interest is the overriding objective, if that client's personal data is compromised because of a problem on your systems, that goes to the heart of, unfortunately, like we said in the last story, credibility. So it really doesn't reflect very well on a firm when they are subject of a cyber attack of this nature. Now, of course, you would have to tell the regulator, the ICO, and indeed the SRA if you had a fairly major breach, which they will have done. It looks like they made that announcement. It looks like they first announced that this attack took place a month ago. So if you're a large firm, very often it makes sense that if you're then going to have to send out an email to thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of clients, very often they then issue a press release, because you don't want then a cohort of those clients going, huh, they've been hacked, that's not very good, let's tell the local paper. Sometimes it's better to, if you issue a press release, get ahead of the story. We've been hacked. We are doing all we can to support our clients. We've notified all the regulators. We've got an ongoing investigation. We are supporting our clients. Basically, try and show that you're doing everything that you can be expected to do, and that there's nothing nefarious, or there's no cover-up, no whitewash attempted. In this instance, of course, you would send out, in this instance, that they've told the clients, they will have told third parties, they've done a press release last month, but now they're having to give an update because it's had an impact on the profitability of the business. So they're saying our profitability has been affected, profit warning, and you've got to tell the market. So because you're publicly traded, you then have to go and tell the market, oh, looks like our profits are going to be down this year, and one big reason is we were hacked, hence this fairly detailed update being given to the market. And it kind of shows when it comes to a cyber attack. I'm often being asked, well, what is the consequence? What's the worst that can happen? And I always say it's not just the fact that you could face, millions of pounds being fined by the ICO. And we had an example earlier in this discussion of a millions of pounds fine from the ICO. So it does happen. And last month, again, they did fine a law firm, Tuckers, for a cyber attack. So yes, the big regulatory fine can happen, but you can also have a class action from the affected data subjects. Is that your clients? Is that, if it's your payroll that's gone, is that staff? Is that third parties that you're processing data for? Who knows? But the point is, fine from the regulator. You could face a class action. You could then have clients that go elsewhere. That will affect your profitability. You could have staff leave. So suddenly if a few partners go, well, I don't like the look of this, I'm off and I'm going to take my work and my team with me, that will affect profitability. So all of those things, so that can affect profitability. And you can quickly find yourself in a downward spiral. Don't forget now, if someone goes on Google and searches the INCE group, INCE, what are they going to find? Lots of stories saying we've been hacked. So, if you're thinking, oh, I think I'll instruct them, they sound really good, and then the first thing you see is we've been hacked, are you going to instruct them? Probably not. So this becomes a real problem with a large firm like that. Suddenly reputation just goes down the plug hole. And that becomes a major problem in itself. So the problems are not just, oh, you could face a big regulatory fine. It's things like class actions. It's the wider costs of a cleanup. It's the blow to credibility. And it's things like this sort of spiral that can set in that affects ongoing profitability for a current financial year and then potentially ongoing loss of profitability as well. So this illustrates really well the broader consequences of a cyber attack and the way it can impact the ongoing success of a business.
Thanks, Peter. So we're back looking at yet another regulator in our next story. So this is looking at Offgem. And this is a new scam that, obviously, given the current climate with the energy crisis that is affecting basically everyone, there are a lot of people trying to take advantage of this and are impersonating Offgem and creating scams. I will pass over to Peter, but this is kind of an obvious story to look at when there is so much panic in relation to energy.
It is, and this is actually an extension almost of stories that we've looked at in the past. So we've looked at the past at, the fact that during the lockdowns there was a lot of delivery fraud. Here's an email saying, oh, your Amazon delivery's outside, please click here, or about your order, please click here. Those have continued. And then, of course, the pandemic, and we aren't perhaps relying on Amazon and home delivery quite in the volume that we were. But of course, the big thing now is everyone's really worried about energy prices. So if then you get an email purportedly from Offgem, something that looks official, something that says, you are entitled to such and such rebate, such and such support, please click here to receive your cash payment, people might click on it, and people have been clicking on it. So in this instance, Offgem, the UK official energy regulator, has turned around and has given this guidance to say, be careful, we aren't emailing people saying we're Santa Claus and here's loads of cash, and making it clear that isn't how the various bits of state help will be assisting. This is actually particularly relevant given that the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK has today announced a further package of help and support. So there's going to be rebates on bills, there's going to be particular help for those on income support, particular help for those on disability living allowance. Yeah, quite a complex list of different things. So, if you wanted to then take advantage of that, you'd just send someone a communication saying, hello, in order to receive your disability living allowance uplift, please click here. If you're on income support and you qualify for this benefit, please click here. When of course that isn't actually how these mechanisms will actually work. In the vast majority of instances, the electricity providers, etc., they know who is entitled to what, and they will automatically process it. It's in the same way that the council tax rebate that was announced earlier this year, you didn't have to personally go and do anything. The council was then supposed to give you back that money. Some councils took rather a lot more time to do that than they should have done, but that's another story. But the point is that very often these things are done without you as a consumer actually having to do anything. But if you're a fraudster and you can suggest, you will be aware, you will have read that you are entitled to this support, please click here to make sure you get that support. You can even, as a fraudster, be really vicious with this and say, if you do not click here within so many days or so many hours, you will lose the entitlement to this support, and panic people, bounce them into clicking on it. And this is a famous thing. They'll impersonate HMRC saying you have to click on here now in order to make sure that you don't receive a fine, or we're about to, very often there's the automated calls saying, this is HMRC, write down this number because you are going to be in front of the tribunal about X, Y, Z. And it's all rubbish. It's just fraudsters trying to panic you and bounce you into it. I had one 90-year-old relative who received a call supposed to be from HMRC, saying, you have to go and submit this information on your tax return. And thankfully, even though she was 90-odd years old, she said, that's very nice, but I haven't worked for 30 years or received a paycheck, so I'm afraid I don't complete a tax return, and you're clearly mistaken. Thank you very much. Goodbye. But how many people would be sharp enough to know they need to do that? And this highlights this constant battle that is taking place. And the really frustrating thing is that I don't think government understands the sheer volume of this fraud that is taking place, and the sheer volume of it that's successful, with taxpayers being ripped off and defrauded, when in reality all they're doing is what they think is right in order to receive any benefits and support that they should be getting. And I mean, it's a particularly vicious crime. It's 2022, there's problems with the cost of living, and these people are making money off it. And rather than it just being, an update from the National Cybersecurity Centre, so this goes on its weekly threat report, I think some more concrete action should be taken to stop people being ripped off. But that would require more investment in action fraud and more investment in law enforcement services, and no one seems to want to grasp that nettle and do anything about it. So they convince themselves that, oh, well, the recorded volumes of this type of fraud are only quite small, and that's because who wants to go to the police and admit you've been a mug and you've been ripped off? No one. So the actual true volume is far higher than the small amount that's actually making it through into the official statistics. And until government wakes up and realizes that, this will continue to become a growing issue, and more people will be affected by it. I remain convinced that if someone founded a political party and said, we are going to stop fraud, particularly online fraud, I think you'd win a massive majority at an election, because you'd show that you were doing something about something that affects everyone.
Thanks, Peter. Moving on to our final story of the day, we're going back to the ICO now, to John Edwards. So John Edwards yesterday gave a speech in Brussels, and this is kind of looking at the background of the Queen's speech that we spoke about last week. So this is looking at changing the application of GDPR in the UK. So this is looking at the law reform bill that will be coming in, and essentially John here is assuring everyone that despite the fact that changes are being proposed and there are some hypothetical gains that could be made here, that they have been working closely to make sure that we do not lose adequacy, and adequacy is exceptionally important, and I'll pass over to Peter to explain why.
Thanks, Amelia. I was just, while you were talking there, looking at the actual text of John Edwards' speech. And he speaks very, very well, as you would expect. However, the problem, and I did hear an interview that John Edwards gave on a podcast a few weeks back, talks very, very knowledgeably, very, very well. And then you actually stop and say, well, what did he actually say? And the answer is very little. And it's a bit like we looked at the Queen's speech the other week, which announced data reform. Oh, great. What are they going to do? And you look at it, both in the speech and in the briefing given to the lobby, and it tells you we're going to reform the law. It doesn't tell you what they're going to do. And unfortunately, of course, there's very little of substance in this speech as well. So this was a speech at the UK ambassador's residence in Brussels. I think it's quite important, to give a marker to Brussels. The UK Queen's speech, it was announced there will be data reform. The UK will diverge from GDPR, which is currently incorporated into UK law with the UK GDPR and the UK Data Protection Act 2018. How are we going to diverge? Well, there's a section of the speech called Avoid Divergence. How are you going to do that? And this is, how do you square the circle? How do you get away from, what is called a tick box mentality? How do you get away from, in theory, unleashing business and allowing entrepreneurship and innovation, which it is claimed is stifled by the current data protection law? How do you allow that? And of course, this doesn't give you any substantive detail on how that's going to be done. Part of this speech seemed to be about sort of speaking to those in Brussels, saying, don't worry, there's no need to worry about that adequacy decision that the UK has from the European Commission that says data of EU citizens can flow to the UK and the UK back again, and that won't be impinged by any of the things that we are planning. But you can't help but look at how onerous it was for the UK to get that adequacy decision in 2021. It is time limited. It's only 4 years long, and then it will be reviewed. So come 2024, well, you know, the EU has already said, we will look again at your data protection laws and decide whether we're going to renew adequacy. This is the only adequacy decision from the EU to any country that is time limited. I mean, the irony of this, given, you know, the UK was the prime mover when it was a member of the European Union of the introduction of data protection law in the first place, and trying to have more commercially realistic data protection laws in place as a member. The idea that the UK then, after 30 years of being a member, wouldn't get adequacy really should be for the birds. I mean, if you can't give adequacy to someone who's been a member of the EU for 30 years, well, who can you give adequacy to? But there's the complexity of the fact that the UK is a member of the Five Eyes of security surveillance networks, along with the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. And therefore, that's been one of the problems, and therefore the powers that the UK government has under the Investigatory Powers Act was seen as a bit of a bar to getting an adequacy decision. So it's been given, but it was time limited. And that was based on a review of existing laws in 2020. If there is now this bit of regulatory divergence, does this put that adequacy decision at risk? Furthermore, bear in mind that relations between Europe and the UK are not exactly a bed of roses at the moment. There is a lot of tension, despite, in theory, the sort of Western unity in the face of Russian aggression in Ukraine. There is increasing problems between the UK and the EU over the Northern Ireland Protocol. A trade war is being threatened again, if you read the statements out of the UK government and out of the European Union, I hasten to add. Marek Sefcovic, the European representative looking at the Northern Ireland Protocol, basically threatened a trade war last week. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that that adequacy decision ends up being struck down. So in the light of all of that, you know, is John Edwards going to turn up and wave a piece of paper and go, peace in our time? No, he's not. So really part of the, you know, to actually stand up and make a substantive speech and not say anything remains, I think, one of his greatest gifts. And of course, there's nothing in here that he could say that could really give anyone reassurance that there couldn't be a whole full-scale breakdown of relations between the European Union and the United Kingdom when it comes to the sharing of personal data. I mean, the impact of that on trade and commerce would be immense. But if you're looking at it in the context of a wider breakdown of the trading relationship currently secured with a trade deal between Europe and the UK, I mean, that would have a fairly drastic impact on international trade too. I think the only thing the UK can hold on to is the fact that at least the UK's trade with the other world has increased in the last few years since it left the European Union, and will probably continue to do so. But interestingly, that was happening before it left the EU anyway. So coming back to John Edwards' speech, you know, he had to make it clear that, you know, the UK is no longer on the European Data Protection Board. And while that's regrettable, you know, he's still talking about working together. He's still talking about the flow of data, cooperating when it comes to enforcement, which is all very well and nice and sounds great. And he's talked about a digital regulatory cooperation forum where the UK brings together the Competition and Markets Authority, the Financial Conduct Authority, Ofcom, and other regulators to try and regulate things like ad tech, which is all well and good. But there's still a lot of detail that remains to be properly worked out here, and we wait for more concrete information ultimately.
Thanks, Peter. So it would be great to kind of look out and see what changes there. No doubt we'll be talking about this again, probably in the near future. And that was our last news story for today. So a big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this webinar, and we'll be back next week. Just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel, as well as podcast channels such as Spotify and both Amazon and Apple Music. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again soon.